long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Jennifer Rauch, professor of journalism and communication studies at Long Island University, Brooklyn. Dr. Rauch is an award-winning writer, educator, and researcher whose work focuses on alternative media, media activism, and popular culture. And today we're going to be talking about her book, Slow Media: Why Slow is Satisfying, Sustainable, and Smart. Jennifer Rauch, welcome to the show.
Hi there, Michael. It's so great to be talking with you and Politics Guys about this.
You know, I've been looking forward to this because, well, there are a lot of reasons actually, but one of the things I caught on to right away was you mentioned that one of your main influences was Neil Postman, which is where I want to start because Neil Postman has just been hugely influential to me. When I was back in college a million years ago, I just sort of happened across, amusing ourselves to death in the bookstore there when college bookstores actually, carried books as opposed to just hoodies and so forth. But anyway, I read it and my mind was just blown. It's one of those few books that changed the way I look at the world. And I've been using it ever since, assigning it, forcing my students to read it, I guess. And so I was hoping we could start with you talking a little bit about what Postman's influence on you has been.
Yeah, it's so cool to hear that. Amazing Ourselves to Death was just a seminal book for so many students and teachers and scholars. I've actually interviewed a lot of political activists who say that it forever influenced how they think about public discourse.
Wow.
Unlike for you, for me, there was really no aha moment with Postman. I feel like he's just always been there. In particular, he influenced me with his idea that TV doesn't just reflect culture, but that it also shapes our culture. And that in this cycle, TV has kind of become our culture, that it's really rearranged our whole communication environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find myself longing for a sort of a 21st century Neil Postman to update that argument for the internet age, where I think it's even more true than it's, ever been before, really.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He says that TV, and every medium really embodies certain biases and promotes certain ways of knowing or of learning about the world, things like trivialization or commercialization. And he was writing that in 1985?
Yeah.
But nowadays, corporate social networks have extended a lot of those tendencies. What I really like is his one driving theme, the question, what is information for?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We tend to assume that our problems are the result of insufficient data, that we could solve social problems if we just had more information. But clearly that's not so. We have tons of information. It's not information that we need, it's knowledge and wisdom. And those don't necessarily come from using more media or from getting more news.
Yeah, and that, of course, ties directly into one of the prime messages of your book, Slow Media. But before we get into that, and we definitely will, I wanted to mention to listeners that you actually had an interesting, I guess I'll call it experience. And this is a ways before you even probably had the idea for the book, your extended digital retreat. And so I thought it'd be a good way to kind of get into this. If you could talk a little bit about, when you did it, why you decided to do it, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the digital retreat was actually what spurred me to write this book, in part. I started thinking about slow media back in 2009 when I was writing a blog called Slow Media that kind of reflected on my own disenchantment with digital media and my kind of craving for the loss of analog alternatives. And I just thought it would be fun and challenging to pretend that I lived in a pre-digital world. I kind of feel like I used to be a more well-rounded person in some ways back then, that, over time I've lost touch with a lot of hobbies and habits that I used to enjoy, like going places in the physical world and interacting with people face to face. I kind of picked the year 1989 because at the time it was a nice round 20 years ago, and the late 1980s were formative for me. And also because it was just kind of on the cusp of the rising digital era.
Yeah. And I love the fact that you started the whole thing right on July 4th. And there's one obvious reason for that. But of course, there's one less obvious reason that I wasn't aware of either.
Yeah, I was doing it partly to celebrate my new freedom. It seemed symbolic in that way.
There you
But it
go.
was also in honor of the dates that Thoreau started his famous retreat at Walden Pond.
Yeah. And you got to think that Thoreau would be all for slow media, certainly.
Yeah, although there's some misconceptions. People think that he was a hermit living off in the cave away from humanity, but the cabin was actually just a short walk outside of town, and he had visitors there all the time. So he was a pretty social guy. He wasn't a hermit.
Right. Slow doesn't mean antisocial. That's an important point. Absolutely. And so going back to that age of VCRs and analog, mostly everything and so forth, what I'm sure there were a lot of challenges, but what do you feel the main challenge was then?
Nothing.
Nothing.
No. Well, the preparation was hard. It took a
Yeah.
few months actually for me to plan the retreats, to get a landline installed. I had to buy a fax machine, an answering machine, typewriter, Polaroid film. Um, it also involves alerting people to the fact that I'm not going to be digitally
Yeah.
available for a while, to try and anticipate all the digital expectations that I would need to extricate myself from. As a and overall, though, the toughest thing was probably managing external demands
Yeah.
from other people more so than my own internal cravings.
Right.
I did have a system for letting myself online for 1 hour a month to deal with emergencies. And part of that was just to see what kind of actual emergencies might arise as opposed to these perceived emergencies like FOMO.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And I learned that there weren't a lot of emergencies. There were a couple of banking issues. Otherwise, I was getting married at the time, and I feel like the wedding industrial complex definitely requires you to do online research.
Well, you mentioned the FOMO thing and that kind of that sense that we have of anxiety and needing to kind of catch up with the latest, what have you, and certainly that ties into that sort of post-Minion, if you will, message of how the modern media has sort of just driven us to this sort of anxious and exhausted state. And certainly, my gosh, I mean, I follow politics for a living, and you can certainly see it there.
Yeah, definitely.
And of course, you did this in 2009. And I thought about that. Of course, 2009, well, there were smartphones, but it wasn't, I mean, most people didn't have smartphones at that time. And according to some stats I looked up, broadband was somewhere at around, I don't know, less than a quarter or somewhere around there, much lower, obviously. But now I would think doing the kind of thing that you did would be so much more challenging today than it was, 10 years ago.
Yes, it would. Absolutely. Partly it was the timing. Partly it was also the place that I was at. I think maybe it was easier for me to go offline in New York City, where you have a lot of resources physically
Sure.
available, like camera shops and travel agencies or payphones. I mean, there were payphones everywhere and they worked. On the other hand, those businesses might be technically available, but it's a 3-hour round trip to
Yeah.
get there and back. It might have been easier to just buy things online and let people deliver it to me at that point.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. The
but
blessing and the curse of Amazon.
yeah, exactly. Our digital media use is really, location dependent and also time dependent. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book now was to encourage other people to find times and spaces of disconnection in their own lives. I was thinking if I wanted to do another extended retreat today, I kind of need other people's permission to do
Right.
it. My husband, my friends, family, colleagues, and if they wanted to, they would need mine. So in this book, I'm kind of paying it forward,
Yeah.
you
And,
know.
and it's not like this is some bizarre fringe thing. At least if you listen to what most Americans say to pollsters, that there are millions, tens of millions of Americans who at least like the idea of taking some sort of a break, but I think they just probably feel trapped in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. People want time for reflection to respond to their own needs instead of to other people's. Being virtually connected is stressful mentally, physically, and people want to be more autonomous. They want to get off the digital leash.
Yeah,
Like I was talking about a moment ago, it's appealing to reconnect with our physical environments and with other people, and to just use our bodies and experience our senses.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of politics, what I found is that I'm so focused on tweets and social and the whatever the outrage of the day sort of thing. I have a lot less time for books than I had back in the day. Of course, I was younger and had fewer responsibilities, another issue, but still, it's very difficult for me to do the sort of deep thinking about a lot of issues because it feels like so much is coming at me all the time, and I feel like I'm much poorer for that. And that gets, I guess, more into kind of the Nicholas Carr argument about the shallows, essentially.
Yeah, it takes work to avoid work. It takes
Yeah.
work to be reflective and sort of arrange your physical and your mental environment to engage with digital media in ways that are good for you.
And so I assume your retreat was a sort of a refreshing experience in a lot of ways, and rejuvenating, I would imagine, in a lot of ways as well.
It was. I tackled my to-do list of reading. I had this stack of books sitting next to me for years that I never got around to.
Yeah,
So that was a great joy. My main lesson from it was just that I can live without digital media and be totally happy. That we can live without digital media. Life isn't necessarily worse without it. It isn't necessarily better without it either. It's just
right.
different.
Yeah. And so let's get into more specifically the slow media movement that you talk about in the book. Now, it I'd heard of slow food before, and of course, as you mentioned in the book, slow media takes an awful lot from slow food. And in the book, you write, slow media, like slow food, encourages people to reassess consumer culture, to conserve natural resources, to resist commodification, to fight standardization, and to preserve traditional tastes. Now, there's an awful lot there. So, but I think that's really important. And so, what I thought we could maybe do was take a look at each of those things, starting off with that reassessment of consumer culture.
Yeah, they do all tie together. One of the important things that I learned from the slow food movement is kind of counterintuitively that it's not really about going slow.
Hmm.
It's not anti-speed.
Right.
It's more that slow is a metaphor for an anti-industrial attitude, which also ties into sustainability. It's slow food is largely a critique of the industrial production of food, the idea that food is just a commodity to be produced as quickly and efficiently and cheaply as possible in standardized ways. That when slow food came into being, it was a reaction against McDonald's specifically, against fast food made on an assembly line with little regard to the health of people who eat it or who make it or the natural world that it extracts resources from. That fast food kind of alienates people who eat food from the communities that produce food. So the slow food movement is committed to reestablishing that connection through networks like community sorted community supported agriculture or CSAs and farm to table or farm to fork restaurants. It's the idea of knowing your farmers, knowing where they are and how they make your food and what their ethical and environmental commitments are. And because you know that, you are willing to directly financially support them, even though it sometimes might cost a little bit more than the alternative, which is exploiting all of those resources. So with slow media, I was kind of thinking, what would it be like if people knew they're journalists? If we knew the conditions in which our news is produced and the ethical commitments of the people who are making it? And what would it be like if we directly financially supported journalists or, other media producers who are committed to the public interest and not to corporate profit?
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, a lot of times we hear now the term content creator, which just, I tell you, it grates on me, but if you talk to journalists, and I've talked to more than a few, especially those who've been around for a while, my gosh, what they're expected to do now, as opposed to what they were expected to do 10 or 20 years ago, is so very different. And I got to say, I feel for most of these people. Boy, it sounds like a horrible job in a lot of ways.
It does, yeah. Content is such a generic term. It implies that it doesn't matter what it is in a way, as long as it's some commodity that we can make money off
Yeah,
of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It fills the time and the space. How it doesn't matter. It could be the equivalent of junk food.
Yeah. Now you mentioned sustainability. I want to get into that a little more because it comes up actually in a number of different contexts. And I think when people think about slow food, they say, okay, sustainability, that makes sense in terms of the environment and so forth. But it has a number of interesting meanings when we look at it in terms of slow media. And so could you maybe talk a little bit about what the sustainability of slow media entails?
Sure. You could break it down into two things. One is environmental sustainability, and the other is social sustainability. Environmental sustainability is maybe more obvious when you think about food, that you're growing things in organic ways that doesn't poison the planet or the water. Um, Whereas the social sustainability of it is the idea that there are lifestyles and livelihoods that are connected to our food production system that we want to sustain, and that it's better for the people who make food as well as the people who eat food if we do it in a socially conscious way. The idea of sitting with friends or with family and enjoying a slow meal where you really connect with each other is better than sitting at your desk alone eating a hamburger.
Yeah.
So if you translate that into media use, then the idea becomes, how does our media use not only affect the planet, which it does in a lot of ways that aren't obvious. Um, we often talk about digital media as being virtual media when they're anything but. They touch down on the earth in all kinds of different ways, and data centers and all of the resources that they extract. It's not this amorphous kind of figurative cloud that we're keeping all of our data in. It's basically factory towns
Yeah.
that use a lot of electricity and that create a lot of pollution.
And so a surprising amount. I mean, you mentioned you have some statistics in the book that sort of, I got to say, they really surprised the heck out of me in terms of the environmental costs that I just never had even thought about before. And I guess that's part of your point.
Yeah, a lot of people haven't. And it's actually something that's just been kind of coming to people's awareness, on the individual and collective levels for the past few years, that until recently there wasn't any research or a lot of attention paid to this. Nowadays, we have a lot better knowledge of what's going on in our digital media system. And we have activist groups like Greenpeace who are doing a lot to bring it to the public attention and to try and hold companies accountable for the way that huge digital media corporations, Facebook or Google or Amazon, impact the world through their sustainability policies, or sometimes lack thereof.
Yeah.
So it's a new issue that people didn't know about. When I teach my students about this, a lot of times their initial reaction is to feel guilty that they're using Netflix because they didn't realize what a drain on natural resources it is, or that every time they buy a new phone, it's going into the
Right.
chances are very good that it's going to be going into a landfill in a foreign country where it's going to poison poor people directly or indirectly. But we don't know this, and we didn't make these choices. The difference is now that we are learning, we have to start exerting ourselves on the system to try and have it be a little bit more responsive,
Yeah.
which
So
it hasn't been so far.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be an all or nothing thing. It could just be, well, do I need to get the Galaxy S10, or can I just wait a generation, that sort of thing? And that's at least doing, I would think, a little bit. And those sort of small things add up over millions of people.
Yeah, but that it even goes beyond the individual. I mean, you don't make a decision about what the longevity of your phone is going to
Right.
be, or what features it's going to have, or even the fact that it's not modular, that if one part of it breaks, you can't just replace the broken part, you have to throw away the whole thing. Um, so if we can create a system that makes more sense, that's more sustainable, then we have better choices to make as individual people.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know a number of states are sort of trying to slowly push for what are called right to repair laws, and there are some pretty
Yeah.
big companies that Apple really hates that idea that you would violate the sacred beauty of their cases and so forth. But
Right.
and so there is a lot of pushback, and you can understand why engineered obsolescence means higher profits, but it
Sure.
also means those environmental issues as well.
It does.
Now, you mentioned when you were talking about this ideal kind of slow food with people gathering over the meal and all that, and it's kind of a nice thing. And it actually made me think in terms of a media analogy, because there was a time, geez, it seems like a million years ago now, where, and this is going to sound so hopelessly kind of like a privileged upper or middle class sort of cliche, but where my wife and I would read the Sunday Times together, and the picture is
Yeah.
kind of making me cringe, but it was kind of a nice thing, and it was slow, and it was actually sort of a shared experience and so forth, and it just became less convenient. Our lives got more crowded. I ended up canceling my print subscription, and now we just kind of, get our news the way everyone else pretty much gets their news. And there's a real sense of loss there, I think, though.
Maybe you can replicate that experience somehow.
I'd like to, and this gets into a point you make in the book. You talk about a number of times this idea of the politics of time, or sometimes chronopolitics.
Yeah.
I'd never really thought about that, and I wasn't familiar with the term. And so I was hoping you can kind of talk about that issue and how that relates to, and how it applies to slow media.
Essentially, the politics of time is the idea that most people don't have enough control over their own time, that we can't control the way that we spend our precious hours on Earth. The social history of time is actually fascinating. It goes back to medieval days when church bells rang to tell you when it was time to pray, which continues to some extent today in various places and cultures. Politics really ramped up in the early 18th century, kind of at the dawn of the industrial era, when factories were starting to demand that workers work for a certain number of hours, 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day from time X to time Y. And for people who had been adapted to farming traditions, that idea of putting in face time and performing work kind of seemed abstract compared to agriculture, which has its own rhythms with
Right.
certain times of the day or the season or the year when you have to do certain tasks. There's a time to sow and a time to reap, a time to birth the calf and a time to milk the cow. Um, Over the past 2 centuries of the industrial era, discipline over the workforce has dramatically increased with expectations of efficiency and productivity and timeliness and responsiveness and immediacy, which a lot of people today, I think, have kind of internalized that logic.
Yeah.
And digital technologies have only extended that kind of managerial control so that a lot of people today, don't control their own schedules. They're expected to be connected to their jobs through media and to check in or participate during hours when they're not even on the clock. So that a lot of work weeks have expanded. So people are working 50 or 60 hours a week without additional compensation. So a lot of it is political, that it seems like just this little lifestyle thing, but in a way, these gestures like unplugging can be a way of pushing back against overwork and exploitation. The problem is that this kind of resistance is not an option for everyone, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you really kind of follow the logic, it seems to me that this really gets into a pretty significant critique of modern capitalism, really.
Oh, absolutely. That's one thing that I talk in my book too about the idea and the history of the Luddite movement,
Yeah.
which was an early 19th century rebellion in the north of England by factory workers against the way that early capitalists were using human people as resources instead of treating them like human beings, essentially. Um, and the Luddites' history is just absolutely fascinating. We hear the term Luddites now a lot, but the term as we use it has almost no connection to this historical movement that takes its
Right.
name. The Luddites were originally kind of working class heroes that they started protesting and sabotaging factories of people, of capitalists who were misusing them. And they had a lot of support from their communities in the sense that the state was putting out bounties on them and offering rewards to people who turned out the Luddite leaders, but nobody did it because they supported the ideas and the movement that the Luddites were engaging in. they went from being kind of community heroes to turning into villains, partly because they were using a lot of violence in the destruction of property, and they were held out as being this threat to safety and security. Even though they never hurt people, they went to great lengths only to like destroy machines or capitalist property. So for a long time, they had a bad reputation, and a lot of pro-business people, including a lot of politicians, kind of sullied their name and held them out as this example of a thing that you should never do because they were so dangerous.
Sure.
It wasn't until the 20th century that people went back and kind of reappraised the Luddites and said, wait a minute, they weren't against technology. They actually were skilled machinists who used these hosiery frames or looms or things like this, that they actually enjoyed making things with machines. They weren't afraid of technology. They didn't hate technology. What they didn't like was the way people were using technology to make them and their families financially insecure. So, I mean, that's the tradition of Luddites that I'm kind of more excited about, and destroying this myth that they were anti-technology or that they were dangerous or that they were irrational, because what they did was entirely rational to stand up against people who were changing their conditions of work in a dangerous way.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of the book. And when you talked about them being dangerous, the immediate thought that came into my head, and maybe this just shows kind of my left of centerness, I guess, is that, well, you can slowly destroy people's lives for generations and you're not dangerous, but once you start destroying property of owners of businesses, well, then all of a sudden it's something must be done, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean that goes to the heart of what news is. That journalism is based on covering things that happen fast, that can be told in a short story, and
Yeah.
particularly on events and not on issues. It's easier to get some striking photos of a protest and talk about all the crazy things that protesters were doing, perhaps dangerous things, than it is to talk about why the protesters are taking the action that they do and what the issues are that they are standing up for and what the solutions are that they see to problems. None of that really makes for great footage on the TV news.
Yeah, definitely not. And again, that gets to that idea that the medium sort of drives the message in a sense. I guess we need to name check Marshall McLuhan in here since we're doing all the other biggies. But you mentioned slow journalism, and I want to focus a little more explicitly on that since we're all about politics and news media and so forth on this show. And in the book, you write at one point, slow journalism can have at least 7 layers of meaning: slow, investigative, less, narrative, fair, community-oriented, and participatory. Now I got to say, when I read that, because when I thought slow journalism, I just thought, yeah, I remember when I got the Washington Post National Weekly Edition, and that was my news, and it was slow because it came out once a week. But you're talking about something that's much more all-encompassing. That's one part of it, certainly, but there are other parts as well that are very important. And I guess you would say that they kind of make up sort of an integrated whole in a sense, right?
Yeah, not to overgeneralize, because there are a lot of different facets that slow journalism kind of holds out these values, or it's sort of an attitude, and then people put it into practice in ways that work for them. A good way of talking about it is probably to give an example of one of my favorite magazines called Delayed Gratification. It's published by a group in London called the Slow Journalism Company. They've been doing it for almost a decade now, but their concept is there's a production aspect of it and a consumption aspect. The production is they only put out this publication quarterly, and there's a time delay built into when they do their reporting and writing about an issue and when the event took place. So rather than covering a breaking news event, something happened today and everybody's going to jump in front of their cameras and try to talk about what's happening and what it means, a lot of which is guesswork, and we won't really understand what happened or why or how until somewhere down the road. They wait until down the road. And with the benefit of hindsight, they talk about what happened 3 months ago and try to fill in the gaps. They try to give you kind of like a big, coherent picture of an event and fill in the gaps of our knowledge and explore some new facet of it that 100 people haven't talked about already. So that's a really cool idea in terms of production. In terms of consumption, it's great because you could pretty much not follow the news at all for 3 months and then just read this one magazine and feel that you're pretty well informed about the major things that happened throughout the world in the previous quarter.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea because, well, first off, I think it seems like in terms of filling a gap, of course we have books, but books have a lag of at least a year and usually more than that. I mean, a book that's written a year after event's a pretty quickly written thing, but
Yeah.
there's not a whole lot that really fills that gap of, like, say, a quarter or several months and that sort of thing. And that's it would be a very different sort of perspective on political news. And I've actually tried sort of a little experiment in the past on this where I didn't follow news for a couple of weeks. And then I just kind of looked back at what the headlines were. And I found that really about 90% of the stories I could just trash and not even have to worry about. And I thought, wow, how much of my time am I wasting here? It was really an eye-opening kind of experience.
Yeah, and a lot of people talk about the effect that news consumption, especially in this day and age, is having on their emotions, so that, you're kind of riding this emotional roller coaster, getting invested in
Yeah.
all of the usually dismaying things that are happening in the world. And you could save yourself that roller coaster ride by just taking a more clear-headed view down the road of what happens that really mattered, rather than every new thing that pops up, that a lot of it fades from view. That there's a worry that, oh, there's this new health threat, and then you're down the road, it's
Yeah.
disappeared. Oh, that really wasn't such a health threat at all.
And I try to find, because I'm drawn to this idea, certainly, even though just by nature of my job, I'm sort of naturally sucked into the 24-hour news cycle. But it seems to me that even publications that I think used to exemplify sort of what you're getting at, I'm thinking like The Atlantic maybe, or something like Harper's or some other publications, they've almost had to change what they're doing, just, it seems like, to stay alive. And so then the question I naturally have is, well, is this sort of thing, well, sustainable, I guess, or is it just destined to be kind of a niche product that a few rich people can afford, but for the rest of us, it's just, we are stuck with, McDonald's essentially.
Yeah. Under current circumstances, slow journalism is sort of a niche product, but we all know that current circumstances in the news industry have to change.
Yeah.
First of all, we have to take some of the industry out of it. Right now, journalism has to fend for itself as an industrial commodity, when really more news, I mean, not all of it, but more of it needs to be produced in nonprofit contexts for the public interest and not for private profit.
Yeah, and that gets into another common critique of slow media, and I guess slow food as well, is that it comes off as sounding very elitist. It's this wonderful luxury good, but if you can't afford it, then that's too bad. And you're obviously aware of this critique, and it sounds like what you're saying is that, well, right now, that's just sort of a necessary result of the larger system, and the only way to change that is actually to change some of that underlying structure, basically.
Yeah, I've heard that critique before, of course.
Yeah, more than a few times, I know.
Yeah.
But and of course, other countries, I mean, do things like publicly fund some of their media, and it's not like there aren't options, even options that have been tried and are at least moderately successful, right?
Right. There are a lot of assumptions about the way the world is having to be the way the world always is, and that's not the case. There's an assumption that slow media and slow food and most iterations of the slow movement are luxuries because they deal with quality of life issues, with, work-life balance. But like you say, it takes time and money to live slowly and sustainably. But for me, the thing is that that's the problem, that people don't have enough time and money. Should work-life balance be a luxury? No, everybody deserves it. So my point is to underscore that we need to take collective actions that promote slower and sustainable living so that it's available to everyone who wants it, or at least to a broader swathe of people. That media use is already a class issue, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm trying to propose some solutions that might sound idealistic, but I think that if we limit our solutions to what seems politically possible, that won't inspire
Sure.
meaningful change.
I mean, and that's how you have to start with things that sound ridiculous. And then over time, maybe it enters the conversation and becomes more of a, well, okay, how do we start doing this actually? But
Yeah.
and it's not like nobody's doing it now. You mentioned delayed gratification. I know there are some other publications that you think are trying to do this and are at least doing a reasonably good job, right?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned them because they're one that's specifically committed to the idea of slow news and calls itself the slow journalism company. There are a lot of other people who are sort of incorporating some of these values a little bit less explicitly, like The Correspondent, which is a Dutch online news site that is coming to America.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that. I'm
Yeah.
waiting. Yes, absolutely.
And there's another one called Tortoise, which again, with that kind of slow moving image, is connecting itself to these ideas. So I think the time is finally ripe that people have been talking about slow media and slow news now for at least a decade, maybe 15 years. But just in this past year, a lot of things have been coming to fruition that tell me that people are starting to realize that there's a problem and that we need to invest in some concrete solutions and some innovative ideas that address it.
But of course, it's a very profitable problem, because even if
Yeah.
people want to do this, I always think there are people making an awful lot of money in Silicon Valley that are working probably 80 hours a week, if not more, to make sure that our media is as non-slow as possible. And
Right.
in an interview I had a while ago with Tyler Cowen, who's a conservative economist, we talked about this. And, this came to me. I said, isn't it kind of like, at least in some ways, that a lot of these big tech companies who are pushing the fastest of the media, they sort of started to remind me of big tobacco in the 90s. There's this highly addictive product that's designed to be addictive. It seems pretty clear now, we're getting more and more evidence that it's actually bad for people in many ways. I mean, literally bad for people. And I know there's some debate on this, but still the evidence keeps on coming in. And then when you call the companies on this, they say, well, people are free to choose. They don't have to be on Facebook or do this and that. But that's, to me, seems to be a pretty weak argument if you're talking about an addiction as opposed to a choice. And so I'm going to go on a limb here and say that you're probably not going to give me the same response to this that Tyler Cowen gave me.
Well, see, that's interesting because people have been focusing on the promise of digital media for a long time, especially the corporations who have, a motivation to do so. It's really only been in the past few years that people have started to take the pitfalls of digital media more seriously, especially this idea of digital addiction. As you and your listeners probably know, some key people from digital companies like Facebook have come forward with these sort of mea culpas and called attention to just how much psychological manipulation is being designed into networks and devices, like the idea that your photo is a de facto slot machine,
Yeah.
or that the industry is kind of consciously exploiting people's psychological weaknesses to keep them staring at and clicking on their screens. It wasn't until members of the Digerati started coming forward, like Tristan Harris being a big example, who founded the foundation Time Well Spent. When they started coming forward, then people started taking these concerns more seriously and not dismissing them as paranoia or conspiracy theories or pessimism. But the idea of getting people hooked on digital machines makes good business sense. It was never really that far-fetched.
Yeah.
I just want to mention a great quote that I heard recently
Please do.
to the effect that The best minds of our generation have been devoted to trying to make us click on ads, and that sucks.
Yeah, absolutely. Boy, that just and that's the thing is even if I guess that's my concern when I'm pessimistic about this. I think if we just it's great that there are some people who have the resources and are able to think about this and sort of, have the time to try to break away from some of this, much to their betterment, I think. But for a lot of people who live lives that are just so crammed in and packed and they don't have this space, it's not like we can just offer a choice and say, hey, this is bad for you. It seems to me that you can make a good argument that more has to be done. And it's not just breaking up big tech companies. So instead of you have Facebook, you have maybe 2 or 3 companies that we're addicted to. I mean, it's more along the lines of how do we somehow find a way to constrain this technology for the sake of human health and sanity. And I know that sounds, to folks on the right, that sounds pretty out there, but I think it's sort of a legitimate concern.
Yeah, it's not even just about individual well-being. It's about the
Sure.
idea that if our country is serious about being a sovereign democracy, we can't leave news to the so-called free market anymore, right? And it's interesting that we're talking about these things in such an important political year. You might know that there have been a lot of proposals supported by people like Bernie Sanders has a history of supporting these. Andrew Yang has made proposals along this line. Um, some people have talked about ways of funding democratic media to counterbalance the influence that these huge digital companies are having on our news environment. You might know like the media reform movement that's led by an organization called Free Press, and people like Robert McChesney
Mhm.
and John Nichols. They've proposed a citizenship voucher to encourage the growth of independent journalism. The idea is that everyone could get a tax credit of $100 or $200 to allocate to the nonprofit media of their choice. So it's not like public broadcasting where the government just automatically gives money to one source, but that everybody gets to decide what kind of news they want in their world and
Right.
allocate some money in that direction. So that would create a sizable fund for new journalism, both slow and fast.
And ideologically, it would mean if you were a conservative, certainly you could be more than welcome to donate it to the far right conservative news network or what have you, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of ideas suggest that, partisanship in media isn't necessarily terrible as long as we have lots of different partisan media and kind of spread the ideology, pie around a little bit. Um, to a lot of people, these kind of ideas sound a little pie in the sky because, the idea of public subsidies
Hmm.
sounds
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
something that we're not used to, but really our current media system is built on all kinds of public subsidies that we don't know about and that we have no input to. That needs to change. Or another source is people have been talking about the idea of putting a small tax on digital media companies, that they're sitting on these huge mounds of cash that, they're worth more than a lot of countries are, a lot of sovereign states are. And if we just took a tiny sliver of that, we would be able to provide alternatives that were oriented towards the public interest.
yeah, and of course the conservative argument to that as well. The market will do that far more efficiently, and then my
Yeah,
response to that would be, well, the market just basically cares about addicting us and not necessarily, informing us in any real way. But
yeah.
But
So
I know a lot of conservatives are probably at many points, listeners are pulling out their hair at this point. But I also think, of my conservative friends, of which I have many. Some of my best friends are conservative, literally. But you know, they a lot of them would like slower options too, in a
yeah,
lot of way. I mean, it's not. This isn't necessarily, even though as slow media has developed, it seems like the progressivism, even the far left progressivism, all seems to be baked in. I think you can probably find sort of a slow media model that works for people on the right as well. And unfortunately, though, it seems to me that when I look at who's out there doing this, sadly, it doesn't seem like there's really a whole lot of action on the conservative side for this, which feels like kind of a missed opportunity to me, really.
you're totally right. But the slow media values that I'm talking about really do transcend this supposed progressive conservative divide. In some ways, let's admit that that divide is a little bit overblown, that there's a lot more overlap than we usually account for. But a usual idea is that, we typically associate conservatism with religious values. But a lot of the ideas of a digital Sabbath are really rooted in the notion of a religious Sabbath and the idea that there's a part of our lives that lays outside of the market that we can devote to our families and to our communities and to our spiritual life, right? So that might be one of these opportunities that you're talking about where we can build some bridges.
And see, now you're getting into that good old Burkean conservatism, and it just warms the cockles of my heart. But unfortunately, that's not exactly the most popular strain these days, to my great disappointment. But I imagine though listeners who have gotten to this point, and a lot of them I think would probably think, there's a lot to this, and I would like to be able to, still stay informed on politics and what's going on in the world and so forth. But I'm not sure how to start, how to try to make my life less crazy without missing out on the genuinely important things. So, what do you have to say to these folks? Any ideas, any suggestions?
Oh, my book is full of ideas.
Yes,
I
it
actually
is.
have some sort of bullet lists in there of things that you can think about. And part of my message is that our media use is really idiosyncratic, that everybody uses different media at different times in different ways for different reasons, to the extent where some people are Instagram people and other people are Twitter or Facebook, and, nary the twain shall meet, right?
Yeah.
So that you really have to think about being mindful or being intentional about your media use, and especially about the news sources that you choose. I generally advise that you probably need to read, watch, and listen to less news content than you do. You just have to make sure that it's the good stuff. And also that most of us can afford to cut down on our social media use. And especially don't follow any presidents on Twitter because you're just feeding the beast.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm sucked into that. But I think that's a really important point. It seems to me is that you can look at this in two ways. I mean, certainly there's media that maybe is designed in a slow manner, not maybe much of it at this point yet, but you can take regular media, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, or even, Fox News or something. And if you consume it mindfully, you can sort of transform it from your end, I guess, basically.
Yeah, I mean, a few things that I talk about in the book are, first of all, that if you can find a way to check your email less frequently, you're probably doing yourself a favor. There may be some situations in which, your boss or your kids or somebody absolutely needs to be able to reach you, but there are ways that you can maybe manage those expectations if you're lucky. I mean, you should at least try to. If not, another thing that you can do is just create times and spaces in your own life where you're not glued to your screen. For a lot of people, it's the dinner table or the bathroom or the bedroom. Get yourself an alarm clock, and now you don't need to have your phone
Yeah.
next to you on your bedstand so that it's the first thing that you look at when you go to bed, or the first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. I've actually read statistics recently about the number of people who sleep with a phone in their bed or another device and not just next to their bed, and it's kind of stunning. My policy is no devices in bedrooms or bathrooms, and try really hard not to use them at the dining table, although I don't always do it, but I usually do.
Yeah, and definitely don't use them in class because your professor's trying to get you to understand something or other. But
yeah,
anyway.
There's tons of research that shows that you will get more out of your class. You will
There you go.
remember more. First of all, if you don't use your digital device in class. Second of all, if you take notes and don't just tape or video things, which a lot of students do, that you actually need to process the information, and the practice of taking notes and trying to decide, like, what's worth writing down and what do you not really need in your notes, kind of helps you figure out what's important and what's not.
By
And the other
hand. Yeah, I think that's, right. It's that process of actually having to write them down by hand. I think I read that actually makes the difference as well, not just typing everything in like you're a court reporter or something like that.
Right. It's a form of rehearsal, and the way that you drill things into your brain is just by rehearsing it.
Yeah. So I know aside from the book, which definitely people should get, there's also a slow media blog. And I thought maybe before I let you go, you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, my book was actually inspired by this blog that I started keeping about 10 years ago at slowmedia.org, which is where I started thinking about these ideas and trying to look for a community of people who supported these slow media ideas. At first, I thought I was the only person who kind of discovered this idea, but much like Columbus, there were some people already there.
Yeah.
And one of them is a great author named Peter Lawfer, who wrote a book called Slow News, which focuses on how and why people should seek out slow journalism. Also, if you look at my blog, there's a page called Slow Media Resources where I have lots of links to the Slow Media Manifesto and other cool projects.
Yeah, I checked it out. There's a lot of great stuff on there, and we will have the link in the show notes. So definitely do give it a look. I've just so enjoyed talking to you, and thank you so much, Jennifer, for taking the time to talk with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. This has been really interesting. I could go on for another hour, but I think we've done a good job of addressing things.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support is what keeps the show going, and we truly appreciate it. When you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show on Patreon, you don't just get our gratitude, you get a supporters exclusive bonus episode each and every week. Also, supporters at various levels can get additional bonuses like Politics Guys gear and access to a special supporters-only Facebook group. To learn more about all this stuff, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can visit our website, politicsguys.com/support. Subscribing to the show also really helps, as does sharing episodes. Word of mouth is, of course, the best advertising, and we really would appreciate it if you tell folks about the show. Leaving reviews and ratings on whatever podcast app you use is also greatly appreciated. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us, and when we're posting things throughout the week, it's facebook.com/politicsguys page. Finally, we're on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Benji Fishman, and Andra Masker. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.